The Arizona sun hung like a burning coal in the afternoon sky as Jacob Miller rode his tired horse along the edges of his struggling ranch. 3 years of drought had turned his once promising cattle operation into a daily battle for survival. The waterholes had dried to cracked mud, the grass had withered to pale yellow stubble, and his herd had dwindled from 70 head to barely 20. At 42 years old, Jacob felt twice that age, his body worn down by endless labor and his spirit tested by losses that kept piling up like stones on a cairn. He was checking the fence line near the rocky outcropping that marked his eastern boundary when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself it was just the wind playing tricks through the canyon walls. But there it was again, a weak cry that sounded distinctly human. Jacob pulled his horse to a stop and listened intently, his weathered hand shading his eyes as he scanned the brutal landscape. The temperature had to be over 100 degrees, and nothing with sense would be out here in the worst heat of the day. Then he saw her, a small figure stumbling between the rocks about 200 yards away, moving with the desperate, uncoordinated steps of someone at the very edge of collapse. Jacob spurred his horse forward, his heart hammering with a mixture of concern and disbelief. As he drew closer, he could see it was a child, a little girl no more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a torn dress that had once been white, but was now stained with dust and what looked like old blood. Her dark hair hung in tangled mats around a face burned red by the merciless sun. Jacob dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and ran to where the girl had collapsed against a boulder. Her eyes were half closed, her lips cracked and bleeding, and when he touched her arm, her skin was burning with fever. He quickly uncapped his canteen and held it to her lips, letting small amounts of water trickle into her mouth. She coughed and sputtered but managed to swallow, her small hands reaching desperately for the canteen. Jacob had to pull it back gently, knowing that drinking too much too fast after severe dehydration could make things worse. As the girl slowly regained some awareness, Jacob tried to speak to her, asking simple questions about where she came from and where her family was. But the child only stared at him with confused, frightened eyes and responded in words he could not understand. The language sounded vaguely familiar, with rhythms and sounds he had heard before but could not place. What was clear was that she was terrified, alone, and barely clinging to life. Jacob looked around the empty desert, searching for any sign of a wagon, a camp, or other people, but there was nothing except endless rock and sand stretching to the horizon. He made a quick decision. Whatever this child's story was, she needed immediate help, and his ranch was the only shelter for miles. Jacob carefully lifted the girl onto his horse, surprised by how light she was, as if she were made of paper and air. She whimpered softly, but did not resist, too exhausted to do anything but lean against him as he climbed up behind her. As they rode slowly back toward his small ranch house, Jacob tried to piece together how a child could end up alone in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in the territory. The possibilities ran through his mind, each darker than the last. Wagon train attacked by outlaws, family caught in a flash flood while crossing an arroyo. Perhaps she had simply wandered away from a camp and gotten lost in the maze of canyons and mesas that made navigation impossible for those unfamiliar with the land. Whatever had happened, the girl had survived against impossible odds, and now her fate rested in Jacob's calloused, uncertain hands. He thought about his own daughter, who would have been about this age if she had lived, and felt an old pain stirring in his chest that he had tried for years to bury beneath hard work and solitude. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jacob's home was modest, even by frontier standards, just a small adobe structure with a single room, a lean-to stable, and a well that still provided water, even when everything else had dried up. He carried the girl inside and laid her on his own bed, the only real furniture he owned besides a rough wooden table and 2 chairs. He brought more water and a little bread softened in broth, feeding her slowly while she drifted in and out of consciousness. As darkness fell and the desert night brought its sudden, surprising cold, Jacob sat in his chair watching the girl sleep, trying to understand what strange twist of fate had brought her to him. Tomorrow he would need to ride to the nearest settlement. and report finding her. See if anyone knew about missing children or disasters in the area. But for tonight she was safe, fed and protected, and that would have to be enough. Jacob pulled his thin blanket over her small form and settled into his chair for what he expected would be a long, sleepless night of watching and wondering. Jacob woke with a start to the sound of horses, many horses, their hooves creating a soft thunder against the hard-packed earth around his ranch. The first grey light of dawn was just beginning to seep through the small window, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming. But as his eyes adjusted and his mind cleared, he realized the sounds were real and coming from all directions. He moved quickly to the window and felt his blood run cold at what he saw outside. At least 30 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses in a wide semicircle around his house. They were fully armed, their faces painted for what Jacob's limited experience told him might be either ceremony or conflict. In the center of the group sat an older man, whose bearing and elaborate clothing marked him as a leader of significant importance. Beside him was a woman, her face lined with worry and something else that Jacob recognized immediately, because he had worn that same expression for years after losing his own child. It was the look of a parent searching for something precious that had been lost. Jacob's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but he stopped himself. Whatever was happening here, starting a fight would only end one way, and it would not be in his favor. Instead, he glanced back at the bed where the girl still slept, exhausted from her ordeal. In the growing light, he could see her features more clearly now, the high cheekbones, the copper tone of her skin beneath the sunburn, the way her dark hair fell across the pillow. Understanding crashed over him like a wave. This was not a settler's child who had gotten lost. This was an Apache girl, and the people outside had come looking for her. Jacob walked slowly to his door and opened it, stepping outside with his hands clearly visible and empty. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. He stood on the small porch of his adobe house and met the eyes of the leader, trying to convey through posture and expression that he meant no harm. For a long moment, nobody moved or spoke. The tension was thick enough to taste, and Jacob could feel sweat forming on his back despite the morning chill. Then the woman dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward Jacob with determined steps. She stopped just a few feet away, and Jacob could see tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice breaking with emotion, gesturing toward the house and then to her heart. Jacob did not need to understand the words to grasp the meaning. She was asking about her daughter, begging to know if the child was safe, desperate for any news after what must have been a night of unimaginable terror. Jacob nodded slowly and gestured toward the house, stepping aside to let the woman pass. She moved quickly inside, and Jacob heard a cry of joy and relief that needed no translation. The other warriors remained mounted but visibly relaxed, the terrible tension easing as word spread that the child had been found alive. The leader dismounted and approached Jacob, studying him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's core. When he finally spoke, it was in halting but clear English that surprised Jacob with its precision. The leader introduced himself as Goyakla and explained that the girl was his granddaughter, named Kaya. 3 days ago, she had been playing near their camp while the adults were preparing for a seasonal migration. A mountain lion had appeared suddenly, and in the chaos and panic, Kaya had run in the wrong direction, fleeing deep into the canyon system that surrounded their territory. By the time they realized she was missing, a sudden dust storm had erased her tracks, and despite searching desperately for 2 days, they had found no trace of her. They had feared the worst, that she had fallen into a ravine or succumbed to the brutal heat and thirst. Jacob listened carefully, then told his own side of the story, explaining how he had found Kaya yesterday afternoon, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. He described giving her water and food, making her comfortable in his own bed, and planning to seek help at first light. Goyakla translated for the other warriors, and Jacob could see their expressions shifting from suspicion to something approaching respect. In a territory where Apache children were sometimes kidnapped and sold, or where settlers might have simply left her to die out of fear or prejudice, Jacob's simple act of compassion stood out like a beacon. Jacob woke with a start to the sound of horses, many horses. their hooves creating a soft thunder against the hard-packed earth around his ranch. The first grey light of dawn was just beginning to seep through the small window, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming. But as his eyes adjusted and his mind cleared, he realized the sounds were real and coming from all directions. He moved quickly to the window and felt his blood run cold at what he saw outside. At least 30 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses in a wide semicircle around his house. They were fully armed, their faces painted for what Jacob's limited experience told him might be either ceremony or conflict. In the center of the group sat an older man whose bearing and elaborate clothing marked him as a leader of significant importance. Beside him was a woman, her face lined with worry and something else that Jacob recognized immediately, because he had worn that same expression for years after losing his own child. It was the look of a parent searching for something precious that had been lost. Jacob's first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but he stopped himself. Whatever was happening here, starting a fight would only end one way, and it would not be in his favor. Instead, he glanced back at the bed where the girl still slept, exhausted from her ordeal. In the growing light, he could see her features more clearly now. The high cheekbones, the copper tone of her skin beneath the sunburn, the way her dark hair fell across the pillow. Understanding crashed over him like a wave. This was not a settler's child who had gotten lost. This was an Apache girl, and the people outside had come looking for her. Jacob walked slowly to his door and opened it, stepping outside with his hands clearly visible and empty. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dust. He stood on the small porch of his adobe house and met the eyes of the leader, trying to convey through posture and expression that he meant no harm. For a long moment nobody moved or spoke. The tension was thick enough to taste, and Jacob could feel sweat forming on his back despite the morning chill. Then the woman dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward Jacob with determined steps. She stopped just a few feet away, and Jacob could see tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice breaking with emotion, gesturing toward the house and then to her heart. Jacob did not need to understand the words to grasp the meaning. She was asking about her daughter, begging to know if the child was safe, desperate for any news after what must have been a night of unimaginable terror. Jacob nodded slowly and gestured toward the house, stepping aside to let the woman pass. She moved quickly inside, and Jacob heard a cry of joy and relief that needed no translation. The other warriors remained mounted but visibly relaxed, the terrible tension easing as word spread that the child had been found alive. The leader dismounted and approached Jacob, studying him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's core. When he finally spoke, it was in halting but clear English that surprised Jacob with its precision. The leader introduced himself as Goyakla and explained that the girl was his granddaughter, named Kaya. 3 days ago, she had been playing near their camp while the adults were preparing for a seasonal migration. A mountain lion had appeared suddenly, and in the chaos and panic, Kaya had run in the wrong direction, fleeing deep into the canyon system that surrounded their territory. By the time they realized she was missing, a sudden dust storm had erased her tracks, and despite searching desperately for 2 days, they had found no trace of her. They had feared the worst, that she had fallen into a ravine or succumbed to the brutal heat and thirst. Jacob listened carefully, then told his own side of the story, explaining how he had found Kaya yesterday afternoon, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. He described giving her water and food, making her comfortable in his own bed, and planning to seek help at first light. Goyakla translated for the other warriors, and Jacob could see their expressions shifting from suspicion to something approaching respect. In a territory where Apache children were sometimes kidnapped and sold, or where settlers might have simply left her to die out of fear or prejudice, Jacob's simple act of compassion stood out like a beacon. The woman emerged from the house carrying Kaya, who was awake now and clinging to her mother with desperate strength. The child's face was buried in her mother's shoulder, and her small body shook with relieved sobs. Jacob felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he had built around his heart after losing his own family. He understood now that this moment, this reunion, was what he had been unable to experience when fever had taken his wife and daughter 5 years ago. There had been no rescue, No second chance, only grief and the long, slow process of learning to live with an emptiness that never quite healed. Goyakla spoke again, his tone formal but warm. He told Jacob that his actions had created a debt that Apache honor demanded be repaid. Jacob started to protest, saying he had only done what any decent person would do, but Goyakla raised his hand gently. The leader explained that in times of such conflict and mistrust between their peoples, simple decency was actually the rarest and most valuable gift of all. Jacob had not only saved Kaya's life, but had treated her with tenderness and care when he could have turned away or worse. The warriors began to disperse slowly, but Goyakla remained, as did Kaya's mother, whose name Jacob learned was Desba. Through a mixture of English, gestures, and Goyakla's translation, they talked for over an hour. As the sun climbed higher and the desert began to warm, Jacob learned about their community, their struggles to maintain their way of life as more settlers arrived, and the government pushed them toward reservations. Desba listened as Jacob spoke haltingly about his own losses, his failing ranch, and the loneliness that had become his constant companion. Before they left, Goyakla made Jacob a promise. He said that from this day forward, Jacob would be considered a friend to their people, that his ranch would be protected, and that if he ever needed help, he need only ask. More than that, he invited Jacob to visit their camp when the autumn came, to share a meal and see Kaya thriving with her family. Jacob accepted with genuine gratitude, feeling something he had not felt in years, a sense of connection to other human beings, a reminder that he was part of something larger than his own small struggles. As the Apache rode away, Kaya turned in her mother's arms and waved at Jacob with a shy smile. He waved back, standing alone in his dusty yard, watching until they disappeared into the maze of canyons and mesas. The morning sun was fully risen now, promising another day of scorching heat and hard work. But somehow the burden felt lighter than it had in years. The weeks following Kaya's rescue brought changes to Jacob's life that he could never have anticipated. The isolation that had defined his existence for 5 years began to crack and crumble like dried mud under rain. 3 days after the Apache left, Jacob rode out to check his cattle and found a young deer hanging from a tree near his property line, already cleaned and prepared, with no sign of who had left it. A week later, he discovered that the broken section of fence he had been meaning to repair had been fixed overnight with expert craftsmanship that put his own rough carpentry to shame. The gifts continued in small, thoughtful ways. A bundle of medicinal herbs appeared on his porch, with instructions drawn in simple pictures, showing how to prepare them for various ailments. A beautifully woven water basket materialized near his well, its construction so tight it could hold liquid without any lining. Jacob understood these were not payments or charity, but expressions of genuine friendship from people who understood that in the harsh desert, survival often depended on neighbors helping neighbors, regardless of the boundaries that others tried to draw between them. But the changes were not only material. Word had spread through the scattered settler community about Jacob finding and caring for the Apache girl. Reactions were mixed and revealed the deep divisions that marked the territory. Some neighbors, like the elderly couple who ran the general store in the nearest town, praised Jacob for his compassion and humanity. They had always believed that peaceful coexistence was possible if people would just treat each other with basic decency and respect. Others, particularly some of the newer settlers who had arrived with preconceived notions and old prejudices, viewed Jacob with suspicion and accused him of being an Apache sympathizer. One afternoon, while Jacob was in town buying supplies he could barely afford, a man named Dale Hutchins confronted him outside the general store. Hutchins was a large, loud man who had claimed a substantial piece of land adjacent to Apache territory, and who made no secret of his belief that the indigenous people should be removed entirely from the region. He stood in Jacob's path, his face red with anger, and accused the rancher of endangering the entire community by fraternizing with what he called savages. Several other men gathered around, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing. Jacob listened quietly until Hutchins finished his tirade, then responded in a calm voice that carried clearly to everyone within earshot. He said that he had found a dying child and given her food and water, and that if any man present would have done differently, then that man should examine his own conscience and consider what kind of person he truly was. He pointed out that Kaya was just a little girl, innocent of any conflict between adults, and that she had done nothing to deserve being left to die in the desert. Some of the men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Jacob's steady gaze. Hutchins sputtered and tried to continue his argument, but Jacob simply walked past him, loaded his supplies onto his horse, and rode away without another word. That confrontation marked Jacob as different in the eyes of the community, and from that day forward, he existed in a strange middle ground between two worlds. He was not fully accepted by settlers, who saw his friendship with the Apache as betrayal, but he was also not Apache himself, despite the respect and protection they offered him. It was a lonely position in some ways, but Jacob discovered that it also gave him a unique perspective and an unexpected role as someone who could see both sides of the conflicts that constantly threatened to erupt into violence. As summer deepened and the heat became almost unbearable, Jacob kept his promise to stay in contact with Goyakla's people. He rode to a designated meeting place once a month, where he would find either Goyakla himself or other members of the community willing to share news and conversation. Through these careful exchanges, Jacob learned more about Apache culture, their sophisticated understanding of the land, their complex social structures, and their growing desperation as their traditional territories continued to shrink under pressure from the expanding settler population and military presence. During one of these meetings, Desba brought Kaya to see Jacob. The girl had recovered fully from her ordeal and had grown taller in just the few months since he had found her. She was shy at first, hiding behind her mother's skirts, but eventually she approached Jacob and offered him a small carved figure of a horse that she had made herself. Through her mother's translation, she told Jacob that she remembered his kindness, that she had been frightened but he had been gentle, and that she wanted him to have something to remember her by. Jacob accepted the gift with a tightness in his throat, carefully placing the carving in his pocket where he would carry it always. These encounters taught Jacob something important about the supposed enemies that men like Hutchins feared and hated. The Apache people he met were not the dangerous savages of frontier mythology. They were families trying to protect their children, elders trying to preserve their culture, and young people trying to find a path forward in a world that was changing faster than anyone could adapt. They faced terrible choices every day between maintaining their traditional ways and accepting changes that might ensure their survival. They grieved their losses, celebrated their joys, and worried about the future, just like everyone else. One evening, as Jacob sat outside his small house watching the sun set over the distant mountains, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful afternoon when he heard a child crying in the desert. His ranch was still struggling. The drought still pressed down on the land like a physical weight, and he still faced each day with uncertainty about whether he could hold on for another season. But he was no longer alone in his struggles. He had friends who brought him food when supplies ran low, who taught him better ways to conserve water, and who reminded him through their own resilience that survival was as much about community as it was about individual strength. Jacob also realized that he had been given something precious, a purpose beyond mere survival. In a territory torn by conflict and misunderstanding, he had become a bridge between worlds, living proof that friendship could exist across the boundaries that others insisted were insurmountable. It was not a role he had sought, and it came with costs and complications that sometimes kept him awake at night. But it was a role that gave meaning to his days and honor to his life, and that was worth more than all the cattle or land or gold that men fought over in this harsh and beautiful country. Autumn arrived in the Arizona territory with its characteristic drama, bringing cooler nights and occasional storms that turned dry washes into raging torrents within minutes. The drought that had gripped the land for 3 years finally began to ease, and Jacob watched with cautious optimism as his waterholes slowly refilled and patches of green began to appear across his parched rangeland. His cattle, though still few in number, seemed to sense the change and moved with renewed energy across the recovering landscape. For the first time in years, Jacob allowed himself to hope that his ranch might actually survive. But while nature seemed to be offering a reprieve, human tensions in the territory were reaching a dangerous peak. The federal government had announced new policies that would significantly reduce the land designated for Apache communities, forcing them onto smaller reservations far from their traditional territories. The official justification was progress and development, but everyone understood the real motivation was opening more land for settlers and mining operations. Goyakla's people faced an impossible choice between accepting the new terms or resisting and facing military action that they could not hope to win. Jacob learned about the crisis during one of his monthly meetings with Apache friends. The usually calm Goyakla appeared troubled and older somehow, the weight of impossible decisions showing in every line of his weathered face. He explained to Jacob that his people were divided. Some argued for accepting the reservation terms, believing that survival required compromise and adaptation. Others, particularly younger warriors who had seen nothing but broken promises from the government, wanted to resist regardless of the cost. Goyakla himself was caught between his responsibility to protect his people and his understanding that armed resistance would likely end in tragedy. Jacob listened with growing concern, recognizing that the fragile peace he had helped nurture could shatter at any moment. He knew that if violence erupted, everyone would suffer. The Apache would face overwhelming military force, but the settlers would also pay a price in destroyed property, disrupted lives, and the poisoning of relationships that had taken years to build. Men like Hutchins were already using the tension to stoke fears and push for aggressive action against Apache communities, arguing that they should be removed by force before they could cause trouble. A week later, Jacob's fears began to materialize in ways he had dreaded. A supply wagon traveling between settlements was attacked and burned, its goods scattered across the desert. 2 days after that, a remote homestead reported that their horses had been stolen during the night. No one was hurt in either incident, but the message was clear. Someone was deliberately creating conflict, trying to force a confrontation between settlers and Apache. The territorial militia began organizing patrols, and Jacob could feel the situation spiraling toward violence, like water circling a drain. What troubled Jacob most was that the pattern of these attacks did not match typical Apache tactics. The Apache he knew were strategic and purposeful in their actions, not random or destructive for its own sake. These incidents felt manufactured, designed more to create fear and justify harsh responses than to achieve any meaningful objective. Jacob suspected that someone was deliberately trying to sabotage the peace, possibly the same interests that stood to profit from forcing the Apache off their remaining land and opening the territory for unrestricted development. Jacob decided he needed to investigate, even though doing so would put him at odds with many in the settler community who wanted simple answers and quick justice. He began by carefully examining the site of the wagon attack, using tracking skills he had learned from Apache friends over the past months. What he found confirmed his suspicions. The attackers had been clumsy and left obvious trails, unlike the nearly invisible tracks that experienced Apache warriors would leave. More telling, he found a cavalry button torn from a uniform, hidden in the brush near where the wagon had burned. Armed with this evidence, Jacob rode to the militia headquarters and requested a meeting with Captain Anderson, the military commander for the region. Anderson was a career soldier who had fought in numerous campaigns, but he was also known as a man who valued truth over convenience. Jacob presented what he had found and explained his theory that someone was staging attacks to look like Apache raids while actually working to provoke a war that would serve certain economic interests. Anderson listened carefully, his expression unreadable, then asked Jacob to leave the evidence with him and promised to investigate thoroughly. 2 days later, Anderson sent word asking Jacob to meet him at a neutral location. When they met, the captain revealed that his own investigation had uncovered similar inconsistencies. Several of the supposed Apache attacks showed signs of being staged, and Anderson had begun to suspect that a group of men led by Dale Hutchins were behind the incidents. Hutchins and his associates had invested heavily in mining claims that happened to overlap with Apache territory, and they stood to make enormous profits if the indigenous people were forced to relocate. The staged attacks were designed to create public pressure for military action that would clear the land for exploitation. Anderson told Jacob that he planned to arrest Hutchins and his co-conspirators, but he needed time to gather sufficient evidence that would hold up in a territorial court. In the meantime, he asked Jacob to do something dangerous: meet with Goyakla and convince his people to remain calm and avoid any retaliation, even as provocations continued. If the Apache responded to the staged attacks with real violence, it would give Hutchins exactly what he wanted and make it nearly impossible to prove the conspiracy. The peace depended on the Apaches showing restraint in the face of deliberate efforts to provoke them. Jacob rode immediately to the meeting place where he could leave signals for Goyakla. Within hours, the Apache leader arrived with several warriors, and Jacob explained everything he had learned. Goyakla listened gravely, translating for the others, who reacted with anger but also with shrewd understanding. They had suspected treachery but lacked proof. Now that the pattern was clear, they agreed to hold back and trust that justice would be served through proper channels rather than through revenge. But Goyakla warned Jacob that his people's patience had limits, and that if Hutchins was not stopped soon, there were younger warriors who would take matters into their own hands regardless of the consequences. As Jacob rode back to his ranch under a sky filled with autumn stars, he felt the weight of what he had taken on. He had become not just a bridge between cultures, but a crucial link in preventing a war that would destroy everything he cared about. The next few days would determine whether peace or violence would define the future of the territory, and whether one man's commitment to justice and friendship could make a difference when powerful forces were pushing in the opposite direction. He thought of little Kaya, now safe with her family, and of all the other children on both sides who deserved a chance to grow up without the shadow of war hanging over them. That thought gave him the courage to face whatever came next. The confrontation came sooner than Jacob expected, erupting on a cool October morning that started with deceptive calm. Captain Anderson had moved quickly after gathering his evidence, and word spread through the territory that Dale Hutchins and 3 of his associates had been arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and incitement to violence. The evidence was substantial, including testimony from a former member of Hutchins's group who had grown troubled by the scheme and agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for leniency. The arrests should have been a victory for peace, but instead, they ignited a firestorm of controversy that divided the settler community down the middle. Hutchins had supporters who refused to believe he was guilty, convinced that the charges were politically motivated or that the military was protecting Apache interests at the expense of honest settlers. A group of about 20 armed men gathered at Hutchins' ranch, declaring they would resist what they called an unjust arrest and demanding his immediate release. The situation had all the ingredients for a violent disaster. Jacob learned about the standoff when a young courier rode to his ranch with an urgent message from Captain Anderson. The captain was requesting that Jacob come immediately and bring Goyakla if possible, believing that a show of united leadership might defuse the crisis before it exploded into bloodshed. It was a dangerous request that put Jacob directly in the line of fire, but he did not hesitate. He rode to the signal point and left word for Goyakla, then continued toward Hutchins's ranch, arriving in the early afternoon to find an incredibly tense scene. Captain Anderson had positioned his soldiers in a careful perimeter around the ranch, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by Hutchins's supporters, who had fortified the main house and several outbuildings. The two sides faced each other across 100 yards of open ground, weapons ready but not yet firing, both groups knowing that the first shot would unleash chaos that could spread far beyond this single confrontation. Anderson looked relieved when he saw Jacob approaching and quickly briefed him on the situation, explaining that he was trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution, but that Hutchins's men were refusing to listen to reason. Then, in a development that made several soldiers reach nervously for their weapons, Goyakla arrived with about 30 Apache warriors. They approached slowly and deliberately, making no threatening moves, and positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the entire scene. Their presence added a new dimension to the standoff, and Jacob could see panic spreading through Hutchins's supporters as they realized they were now surrounded. Some of the men began arguing among themselves, clearly having second thoughts about their position now that the situation had escalated beyond what they had anticipated. Jacob walked into the open ground between the opposing forces, making himself deliberately visible and vulnerable. His voice carried clearly as he addressed both groups, explaining what he had discovered about the staged attacks and how Hutchins had been willing to start a war that would cost innocent lives on all sides simply to advance his own financial interests. He described finding evidence at the attack sites, the cavalry button, the clumsy tracks, the patterns that did not match genuine Apache tactics. He spoke about Kaya, the little girl whose life had been saved through simple compassion, and asked whether that was the kind of world they wanted to create or destroy. Some of Hutchins's supporters began to lower their weapons, looking uncertain and troubled. Jacob pressed his advantage, calling out specific men by name, people he knew from town, asking them directly whether they truly believed that Hutchins cared about their families and futures, or whether they could see now that they had been manipulated into serving someone else's greed. One by one, men began to step away from the fortified positions, laying down their weapons and walking toward the military lines to surrender peacefully. But Hutchins himself remained defiant, emerging from the main house with a rifle and wild desperation in his eyes. He shouted accusations at Jacob, calling him a traitor and an Apache lover, claiming that the conspiracy was actually against him, orchestrated by people who wanted to protect the indigenous people at the expense of progress and civilization. His voice grew increasingly frantic as he realized his support was crumbling and his schemes were collapsing around him. Jacob stood his ground, meeting Hutchins's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by the rifle pointed in his direction. Goyakla descended from the ridge and walked calmly to stand beside Jacob, an act of solidarity that spoke louder than any words. The Apache leader addressed the remaining settlers in his careful English, explaining that his people wanted only to live in peace on the land that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. He said that men like Hutchins saw them as obstacles to be removed rather than as human beings with families, histories, and rights. He offered his hand to Jacob in a gesture that everyone present could see and understand, a public declaration of friendship and alliance that transcended the divisions others tried to impose. The symbolic power of that moment broke the last resistance. The few men still supporting Hutchins laid down their weapons, and Hutchins himself finally surrendered, the fight draining out of him as he realized he had lost completely. Captain Anderson moved in quickly to take custody of all the conspirators, and the crisis that could have sparked widespread violence ended not with gunfire, but with the simple human connection between two men who chose friendship over fear. In the weeks that followed, life in the Arizona Territory began to shift in small but meaningful ways. The trial of Hutchins and his co-conspirators became a public reckoning with the prejudices and manipulations that had brought the region so close to disaster. The evidence presented in court was overwhelming, and all the defendants were convicted and sentenced to significant prison terms. More importantly, the trial sparked conversations throughout the territory about how people of different backgrounds could coexist with mutual respect rather than constant conflict. Jacob's ranch, which had been failing when he found Kaya in the desert over a year ago, began to thrive as the drought finally broke completely. But more valuable than his recovering cattle herd was the community that had formed around his simple act of compassion. Apache families and settler families began tentative exchanges, learning from each other, sharing resources during difficult times, and slowly building the trust that would be essential for lasting peace. It was imperfect and often difficult, with setbacks and misunderstandings that required patience and forgiveness to overcome. But it was real and growing stronger with each passing season. On a warm spring morning, more than a year after finding Kaya, Jacob stood outside his house and watched as Desba and Goyakla rode up with the young girl sitting proudly on her own horse. Kaya had grown tall and confident, her eyes bright with intelligence and her smile quick and genuine. She dismounted and ran to Jacob, chattering in a mixture of Apache and English about everything she had learned and done since last seeing him. Jacob listened with a smile, marveling at how much had changed since he had stumbled across a dying child in the desert and made the simple choice to help rather than turn away. Goyakla placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder and spoke words that the rancher would treasure for the rest of his life. The Apache leader said that one person showing courage and compassion in a moment of crisis could change the direction of history, that Jacob's choice to save Kaya had created ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could have predicted. He said that Jacob had proven that the boundaries between peoples were not fixed and permanent, but were lines that could be crossed by anyone brave enough to see the humanity in others and act accordingly. As they shared a meal together outside Jacob's house, with the Arizona landscape stretching endlessly in all directions under a brilliant blue sky, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had come west 5 years ago broken by grief and loss, seeking nothing more than isolation and the slow passage of empty days. But by opening his heart to one frightened child, he had rediscovered his own humanity and found a purpose that gave meaning to every morning. He had learned that family was not just about blood, but about the connections we choose to honor and the commitments we make to care for each other across all the boundaries that others try to build. And he had discovered that even in the harshest landscape, hope could take root and grow if tended with patience, courage, and love. Kaya sat beside him, the little girl he had saved now healthy and happy, teaching him words in her language while he taught her more in his. Around them, two families that should have been enemies instead shared food and laughter and stories, building bridges one conversation at a time. It was a small beginning in a vast territory, still marked by division and conflict. But it was real and it mattered, and it proved that another way was possible if enough people had the courage to choose it. As the sun climbed higher and the day warmed toward afternoon, Jacob felt something he had not experienced in years, complete and genuine contentment. The peace that comes from knowing you have lived according to your deepest values and made a difference in the world that will outlast your own brief time beneath the desert sun.